Awesome. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and want to welcome anybody who might be watching this as a recording later. Today, we're very excited to have guest speaker Fraser Shilling here with us. Fraser received his PhD from the University of Southern California, and he's currently the director of the Road Ecology Center at UC Davis. He's also the lead organizer for the International Conference on Ecology and Transportation and co-chair of the Global Congress on Linear Infrastructure and the Environment. So thanks so much for being here, Fraser, and thanks to our members as well for tuning in, and I'll let you take it away.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Catherine. And great to meet all of you virtually. Feel free to turn on your camera, leave it off, ask me questions. If you put up your hand, I may not see it, may not be paying attention to the little images for everybody. So feel free to audio interrupt if you have a clarification question. And then there's plenty of time at the end, I assume, for more questions. Catherine, how long should I take?
We have from 5 to 6, so
okay. Perfect.
As much of that time as you'd like.
Okay, great. So as Catherine mentioned, I'm at the Road Ecology Center at UC Davis, and that center has been around for 15 years. I'm going to call on my crutch here. And so our, there we go. Is that showing up for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the center is a combined education and research center. We have students, graduate students, and undergrads. We have a variety of different kinds of projects. A lot of our work focuses on wildlife and roads in terms of field work and modeling in GIS and statistical analyses. And then we have more conceptual work related to other kinds of transportation. And then, as Catherine mentioned, I organize or co-organize a couple of international conferences, and those are definitely related to other kinds of linear infrastructure beyond roads. And so when I'm using the term roads here, we could probably apply it to think of other things as well, not just a conventional asphalt road going through a forest or going through a town. So I'll be talking about wildlife and roads, and I want to thank a lot of my partners, several of my partners here, who have helped focus on wildlife and roads over the years. The names there at the top definitely have helped formulate some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about, and we've done a number of publications together. And then some of the roadkill data that I'll be showing is collected by members of the California Roadkill Observation System. You can see the web address right there. And then funding from Pew Charitable Trust and National Center for Sustainable Transportation is definitely important in carrying out some of the work that I'm going to talk about. So roads are everywhere, and I put the almost in there because even where there's not conventional roads, there's often some form of human activity, trail, other kind of intrusion by air or water or so forth. So there's very few places in the world where there isn't some kind of transportation in and out. In the map at the bottom left, you can see, this is from a few years ago, a mapping of all the world's paved roads. So this does not include the unpaved roads, the paved roads, and showing that there are areas with few or no paved roads. And then there are giant portions of all of the major continents that are covered with paved roads. And so these are major roads and not all roads again. So you can see that there's only a few, think of them as mega ecosystems in the world where you don't have a lot of road impact in terms of direct road impact. There's obviously still the effects of climate change and other pollutants that are global in nature. But in terms of a direct road impact, there are some areas that still aren't hugely impacted. And then roads on the right-hand side, there's a sort of a colorful gradient there. Hopefully you can tell what part of the map is the road, and that's the line kind of going down north to south, bisected by a blue line, which is a river. And this shows a road, but it also shows the road effect zone. And this is really important in understanding road impacts because they extend beyond just the surface of the road. So in this case, it's State Route 99. And the brown to orange to yellow gradient extending away from the roadway is noise from traffic. And but that could be light at night. It could be nitrogen pollution. There's a variety of other things that extend in a very similar way. And what it shows basically is that the impacts to surrounding ecosystems can extend up to half a mile or a mile in terms of direct impacts away from the road itself. And then obviously things like climate change gases go everywhere. So this is more related to things that are immediately adjacent to the road. And then obviously when wildlife hit the roads, the traffic hits them, and it can result in unpleasant outcomes for wildlife of all different kinds. This is just showing terrestrial vertebrates. Birds get hit, reptiles, amphibians get hit, and then we generally pay attention to the mammals. And actually, usually we pay attention to the larger mammals. And the bear down there is a picture Catherine took, actually. And then the mountain lion is a picture from a San Francisco Chronicle article, and the remainder of pictures that I took. And there's a lot of ecosystem damage that occurs because of this. There's also, I would say, a strain in some ways on the human psyche, thinking about these kinds of impacts as well for people who have hit animals. And so if you think about these wildlife impacts in the context of that map on the bottom left, you can imagine that this kind of occurrence is really a global concern. This is not exclusive to California or any other place that we study it well. It's really a global kind of issue. And to put it in some perspective, there have been only a couple of peer-reviewed publications estimating the total impact of traffic, of what we call wildlife vehicle collisions or roadkill on particular groups of animals. And when I say peer-reviewed, there have been some non-peer-reviewed estimates. So in Brazil, there was an estimate about 300 million mammals and herpetofauna, amphibians and reptiles, are killed on Brazil's roads every year, according to an estimate from a research center there. In the United States, the estimate for birds alone is at a similar order of magnitude. About 200 million birds a year are killed on United States roads and highways, which is in the same order of magnitude as those killed by pets and glass buildings or glass in buildings. So it's, obviously these are big concerns for wildlife populations. For most species, though, and most groups, we really have no idea what this impact is at a species level or a population level. For different kinds of road impacts, some of these are thinking of the road as a physical space. It's got asphalt or concrete. It's a cleared area. So the road physical space has a kind of impact. But quite often the impact is related to traffic. And the list there on the right are different terms, they're terms of art in ecology for the kinds of effects that roads and traffic have on different ecosystem functions. And so I'll just go through them quickly. Genetic fragmentation, and that basically means you take a genetic pool like we have as humans, we can interbreed, we're one genome, one gene pool. When that is fragmented and populations can't communicate genetically, then they start to speciate. They start to become separate populations, separate species, and eventually you have different species altogether. Mortality, obviously we just went through that. Migration disruption, this would be where you take a species that normally migrates and no longer can now. This is true for many mule deer in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, where there's enough road and highway impact that herds of deer can either no longer try to migrate, or the ones that used to migrate got killed off and their descendants never happened. And so now you just have resident herds. You can have subpopulation losses. What this means is that if you have an isolated population of a species by roads or highways, it could wink out, it could go extinct and would not be repopulated because of the roads and highways. And there's a variety of other effects there. The impacts to wildlife as a part of ecosystems vary quite a bit. And the ones I talked about mostly are related to that picture on the top right, and that's the animal attempts to cross and it's killed. while trying to cross a road by a vehicle. But there's also attempts to cross, and you can see this coyote down in the bottom right. It's looking into a crossing structure that was built for wildlife. And at the moment that it spins around and runs off, that's when a car is going by overhead. And so it's responding to traffic by having an aversion response, meaning that it's afraid of the highway and it runs away from the highway, unfortunately at a place where we want them to cross. Some wildlife are attracted to roads, and this might be scavengers who walk along roadsides looking for something to eat, and we quite often find them as roadkill. As they're attempting to scavenge, they also get killed by cars. And the one that is very poorly understood, but is the best case scenario, is that wildlife attempt to cross and they manage to cross, and they don't get hit by cars, and then you have a connectivity across the roadway, so you have successful crossing. An important ecosystem impact of these different kinds of events is that when you kill off species on one side of a road or in one area, then it can have a downstream ecosystem impact. And what that means is that, for example, if you remove the large carnivores from a system, you actually it can result in a change in vegetation. And so this was well studied in Yellowstone, where the loss of large predators in Yellowstone resulted in elk and deer populations booming, being very successful, and moose. And they really ate down the riparian areas until the riparian vegetation was denuded, and streams then became destabilized, and stream banks crumbled. The streams would widen and fill with sediment and have less available water for fish. And so the loss of large predators actually resulted in geomorphological impacts or geological impacts on the landscape. So these are really critical relationships. And so where you have an area where these kinds of effects are occurring, you can have impacts to something as fundamental as geology or the plants that are growing in an area because of losses of these species. So this is not just an aesthetic concern, it's also an ecological concern. We want the government to take responsibility for these things. And so that statement at the top, it appears strong, and it is because we've studied it, a colleague and I in Georgia. We looked through state transportation plans over a couple of different cycles of state transportation plans. And these are basically the products of word searches, looking for, using word searches to find out, do state transportation plans actually take wildlife seriously and wildlife vehicle collision seriously? And the answer is generally no. From California through to Florida, actually California doesn't score very well compared to other states. And thinking about wildlife impacts, so ecosystem processes, ecology, other ways of thinking about the things that I'm talking about, these are generally ignored in the state transportation plan. The importance of this is the state transportation plans really guide how the state funds work, decides what to do, what are the priorities. Are we going to have more rail? Are we going to have wider highways? Are we going to have fewer highways? Or what are we going to do? That all starts with the state transportation plan. So if something's not a priority in the state transportation plan, it's either reflecting that it's not a priority in the transportation agency, or it results in it being not a priority in the transportation agency. And that is reflected in the spending as well, where there's a lot of money available for transportation in different states in the United States, but very little of it is spent on wildlife. And transportation planning itself is very complicated. So actually the state transportation plans are fairly simple documents, but once you get into the planning process for making things happen on the ground, the planning process is very complex. It has very few places for public to be involved. They really design it to not have public involvement, except towards the end, at which point most of the decision-making has already occurred. So it's a very difficult thing to get into and try to change for the benefit of wildlife and ecology. But it's not like there's nothing anybody can do. In some of this, I'm going to use myself as an example, because even though I'm a public agency scientist, a university scientist. I'm also a member of the public. And so I think about how would I want to be involved? How do I want to be involved? What are the kinds of tools that are available? And I've got some listed here that are things that we can think about doing. And this is both you all and also people that the Ecology Center communicates with. Anybody who works on these kinds of issues can think about how to carry out this work. The ones highlighted in yellow are the easiest to support in terms of public involvement. The second one there, help with technical work, that's definitely possible. That's why it's in this list. It's a specialized thing. So for example, if there was someone like me, if I started volunteering for a local watershed group, I have a lot of analytical tools and experience and so forth that I could bring to bear. And so I could be a member of the public in my community helping with item number 2 there. But it's really going to depend on who's around to help with these things. But I think it's still possible. Collecting data, the first one, is one of the easiest and definitely an important way for people to be involved. But the others on the list there are also reasonable to think about. And I'm going to work through each of these to give them put some meat on the bones. So the California Roadkill Observation System is and there's an extra S on the end of that, is a direct way of collecting data. The image on the left there is from the New York Times in 2010. That was a year after the system started. We had this great story in the New York Times, and it really helped us blow up our involvement, because really people only start doing something like this if they hear about it. So how do you get them to hear about it? It's all in the advertising. There's different ways people collect the information. The retired vet shown in that picture is taking a picture in the middle of the road. Caltrans hates this picture because it's a state highway that he's squatting down in the middle of. The picture there in the center was a guy who was riding with his kids about 1,000 miles across the United States. And he did roadkill observations whenever he saw them, which resulted in several hundred, like this one of a deer, roadkill data collections. So these are opportunistic data collections, meaning someone is not designing an experiment or a scientific transect, an set of observations. They're taking the observation whenever they see it. So we call those opportunistic data or presence-only data. On the right-hand side is what it looks like on a phone. And it's a pretty basic tool. In the simplest version is the green button on the phone image there. If you click that button, all you have to do is upload a picture with your location turned on, and that's it. So it's a one-click method for roadkill data collection. If you want to add more information, you can add the species, you can add how often you drive that road and other kinds of information. It's also possible to enter an observation without a photograph, and that's the white button that says enter observation. The result of this is many, 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 many thousands of data points throughout the state. We have, I think, 80-something thousand from the California Roadkill Observation System. Then we have another 40,000 or so from California Highway Patrol observations of crashes involving wildlife. So we have over, I don't know the number off the top of my head, about 120,000 roadkill observations throughout California collected over the last 12 years. And this is a really rich database now. For us, it's resulted in some publications. For wildlife, it's resulted in data, providing data to many local NGOs, state agency people like CDFW or Caltrans, trying to work on a wildlife crossing project, or consultants working for those agencies, academics, especially students, trying to figure out what we should do about roadkill, about wildlife vehicle collisions. And so it's become a really important database, and it's really the unofficial database for roadkill for California. There's nothing else like it in the state. And actually, there's nothing else like it in terms of wildlife data observations in general, except iNaturalist. So that would be the closest thing to this system. And so in terms of tracking wildlife populations, it's probably the most extensive. It's got the most species, and it's been going the longest. We've been going a couple more years than iNaturalist in California. So it's a repository for a lot of important biodiversity information, as well as being a repository for roadkill information. And what it gives us is thinking about where can we act, where can we solve some of these problems. And on the left-hand side, this is a map showing the squiggly sausage line of different colors is a road called Alma Bridge Road next to State Route 17, Santa Clara County. So the highway is on the left side of that map on the bottom left. And then the road curves around the reservoir following the shoreline up about 100 feet from the shoreline, following around the edge. There's probably the largest population of Pacific, certainly the largest known population of Pacific newts live on the right-hand side of that road, and their reproduction area is on the left-hand side, so the reservoir side. They come down from the forested hillsides, they cross the road, and at least half of them die every year crossing that road on the way to the reservoir. What that means is about 5,000 per year die crossing the road. 5,000 before this phenomenon was measured by volunteer scientists. This is not an academic exercise, not an agency project. This is all volunteers going out and collecting these data. Before this project, if you had told an amphibian expert, I found a population of 5,000 Pacific newts, that would be considered a really big population. So 5,000 dying per year is for amphibians that live for multiple years indicates an incredibly big population. It's probably the biggest known population of Pacific newts in California, and a lot of them are being successfully killed on this road. There's been some people have said, well, they've always been killed on this road, but traffic only recently over the last few years has increased quite a bit on this road. And so it's possible that we're actually seeing the beginning of knocking out this population due to roadkill alone. This squiggly line, the red is the worst and green is the best. So you can see that there are some places where there's more red, and this is data for multiple years. And that indicates a place where if you were to do something there, if you were to help the newts across the road, you might have a conservation benefit. And this is actually a very difficult thing to find. It's thanks to a lot of different volunteers for collecting these data. And it results in here's a place we could do something. The map to the right shows a different kind of scale. This is for the whole state. All the different lines of different colors are state highways. So no major public roads, just state highways. And the green places where we have not had anybody measure a large mammal being killed on the road. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened, it just means nobody collected those data. And the dark red indicates the worst case scenario, which is greater than 6 per mile per year. The cutoff for when do you start worrying about this from a safety point of view, public safety point of view, really any collision can be dangerous. But where mitigating this impact starts to really pay for itself is when you have more than 2 per mile per year. Then by reducing or eliminating those collisions, you can actually get more benefit than it costs you to fix the highway. I did not say that very eloquently, and I really apologize. Basically, if you think of it as benefit to cost ratio, the benefit to cost ratio is on the plus side for any road here that's yellow, orange, or red. So this means that using these kinds of data, we can figure out where should we do something, where should we act, where are the highest costs, and this is a slightly different map. It's showing the costs of all of those collisions on all the different miles of state highway in the state. And then how much, and we can think about how much would it cost to fix that, and we can compare that. What's the cost of crashes? What's the cost of fixing it? Does it make economic sense? So even if you don't care about the ecology and the safety, if you only care about the economics, this is one way to think about it. And it shows there's certainly plenty of places we could do something in California. To put this in some perspective, what we know about the costs is that it could be, actually that number is not correct, 1 billion to 2 billion annually. That's 1 billion to 2 billion over a 5-year period. It's about 200 million to 400 million per year from these types of collisions. So in terms of all crashes in California, it's not a giant cost. when you talk about the cities, there's so much traffic and so many crashes there, and fatal crashes and injuries that those are actually where we have the greatest safety concern. But in rural areas, crashes with wildlife can actually be a significant chunk of the total crashes. And you can see on this map that a lot of the red highways are in rural areas. They're outside the cities. And so from a rural perspective, this is an important type of crash and something that we can fix. So how do we decide where to go? That statewide map is useful for somebody like me or maybe Caltrans, but really, how do we narrow this down? And so I zoomed in to just north of, or just around Lake Shasta on the left-hand side, and you can see there's some areas of yellow and light green. That indicates between $20,000 and $60,000 per year per mile on those stretches of I-5. And so that's equivalent to 3 or 4 crashes involving no injuries, or one crash with an injury, a minor injury, or a couple of crashes with minor injuries. So these are areas where you'd expect to have several crashes per year in just a 1 mile segment. So if you think about how fast it takes you a minute or less to drive a mile on the highway, and in a year, you'd expect in these places to have a few crashes. So these are places where you could actually go and put in fencing, maybe a wildlife crossing structure, and it would pay for itself, so to speak, by reducing the collisions and improving safety. On the right-hand side, a slightly more regional look. It's showing the different kinds of data collection. I should have said what the different colored dots are, but hopefully you can see the legend on the bottom right. The brown dots are large mammals, and they could just be a carcass of a large mammal, or it could involve a crash where CHP was responding. And then the other colors are for medium-sized mammals, small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And you can see there's some highways where there's only brown dots, and that indicates that those are places like most of 97, 89, and I think the one to the far north might be 36, but I'm not positive. Those are places where there hasn't been a lot of volunteer data collection. And then you can see on Highway 3 and most of I-5, there's a lot of those different colors, which indicates that these aren't California Highway Patrol observations. These are someone like you guys taking a picture or taking an observation of an animal killed on the road and uploading it to the California Roadkill observation system. So for Highway 3, we have a lot of data about a lot of different species on that road, but for 97 or 89, we have very little information. That doesn't mean that there's no reptiles or small mammals killed on those roads. It just means that nobody reported it. So what can we do about this? And one of the best known types of solutions is building wildlife crossing structures, and primarily undercrossings. And these are often built in areas where you have a lot of those collisions, and it helps to get wildlife under the road primarily, and some of them over the road. California has 1 overcrossing. So that puts us 1 ahead of Oregon, which has 0, and puts us behind all of our red state neighbors who have several each. You can also take it on yourself to help wildlife cross the road or help them if they've been hit. Quite often, California Highway Patrol reports that people will do what this guy's doing on the bottom left, not particularly comfortable for the animal, but the animal's been injured, it might be on a road. People often stop. They often try to rescue the animal if it's injured, get it off the road. Some of them will try to take it to maybe a vet hospital if it's injured. That obviously doesn't make a wild animal happy, but in the case of moving it off the road, it's probably going to benefit the animal somehow, and then stopping traffic in that area will also benefit that animal if it's injured and if it's possible that it can recover from that injury. On the far right is a different kind of event altogether, and this is showing a member of a newt brigade in Sonoma County, where they go out at night when it's raining, when the newts are on the march, similar area to the one I showed before, from some upland vegetated areas down to a lake, one of the few natural lakes in Sonoma County. And so they're marching across this road, and they were getting killed a lot on that road, just like on the one I showed the example before. And this group, the Newt Brigade, decided to do something about it. And so they go out in the rain and they carry the newts across and I'm guessing that they also stop cars that are about to drive across some newts so they can move them across the road as well. There was a story just recently, came out today, actually. There's a link at the bottom there. I'll share this presentation with Catherine so you don't have to write these down. But if you wanted to see some examples of this kind of activity, you can do so. Something that I'm going to try myself out in front of me, out my window, there's 2 trees on either side of it's not really a super minor road. There's about a car a minute. So it's a rural-ish road, edge of a city. And I'm going to build a rope bridge from one tree to the other tree on the other side of the road because I can. And this is why I call it do-it-yourself. Roadkill of arboreal species is definitely a thing. And so if you build a rope bridge for them to get from one side of the road to the other, then they'll use it in almost every case. So if you want to figure out how to do that, I put some links here. If you want to know where you can buy some rope, it's there on the bottom left, and give it a shot. There's also speed and traffic reduction. You can buy your own speed limit signs. I am recommending these as creative activities and not as an official statement of the University of California, Davis. But speed limit signs, whether you do it yourself or you get your city to do it, speed limit reduction, if you can get speed limits reduced and if you can get enforcement of those, is one of the best ways to reduce roadkill in any area. This has been studied in a few places where people have managed to get speeds reduced, particularly in protected areas. And wherever there's been speed reduction and enforced speed reduction, there's been a reduction in roadkill. Quite often it's very dramatic. In a couple of places, there's one place in Taiwan, they close a highway when a particular species of butterfly crosses over it. And so they completely close traffic when those butterflies start to migrate. And there's also a similar bee crossing in Idaho where there's an enforced speed reduction to reduce collisions with bees, native bees, in one particular spot in Idaho. So this is a thing that people can do, but admittedly, it's not easy. State legislation, another thing that's possible. California does not have any requirement to act on wildlife vehicle collision or roadkill. There's also no legislation, no statute to reward that behavior by transportation entities. And all of the transportation folks I know, and there's many that try to do this, to try to build wildlife crossings, they're always battling upstream. Their bosses, this is not a box they can check. We did something for the wildlife. So we definitely need this kind of legislation at the state level. And something to incentivize local agencies also to work on this, maybe through funding pathways, so that we can reduce roadkill. We know where we should do it, and the California Department of Transportation has had this manual in the middle of the bottom of the slide there since 2007. I helped co-write it, and then there's on the left side, we have a repository of a dozen different manuals on how you can collect data and fix problems related to wildlife vehicle collision, but there's still not a formal program to do that. On the right-hand side, you can see the top 10% of places in the state, top 10% of wildlife vehicle collision areas, and these are the ones that would pay for themselves if you started acting on them now. And you can see that I-5 near Shasta, there's not that many in that top 10%. There are a few areas around the North State where that's the case. And I've wondered about this. And because of some parts of I-5 south of Dunsmuir being particularly difficult to access the shoulder, I'm wondering if some of this is just even California Highway Patrol doesn't collect, doesn't report that this is a crash of the wild animal. So that gap you see on I-5 near Shasta, I don't know if that's just a poor data collection gap or if it's actually a real gap, but there's another possibility is that animals are getting hit, but they're getting hit by trucks and they're just not getting reported. And so we don't have data collection because of that as well. But there are many places throughout the state where we could act. And so if we had legislation to enforce it, there's definitely already knowledge there on what we should do. And then at the local level, on the right-hand side, you can see there's a series of little reports we made for different stretches of highway. We actually did one for I-5. I should have put that on here. We can develop these action plans. You could develop an action plan. We developed action plans. You don't need permission to do it. Just get it started. And then this is a really good way to approach a local agency and start the conversation. About half of transportation project funding in California goes through a local agency. And since they are the most accessible to most people, going through a county board or a transportation organization, that might be a good way to start. And because large mammal collisions are demonstrably safety concerns, then you could just go through a safety angle. And for many species, if you build something that's going to work for deer, it's going to work for some other species too. Small animal projects can also be considered safety, and that's a little harder to explain to people, but in safety research, almost anything that flies out or runs out into the road can result in somebody crashing because of our initial response to that. If you want more information or to get involved in different kinds of projects, the California Roadkill Observation System link is the first one there. If you want to see our other work at the Road Ecology Center, it's the second link. And then anybody feel free to email me at any time, ask me questions, and I'd be happy to answer them. So that's all I got. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Fraser. Nick, I think you had a question. Would you like to ask it out loud?
Sure. Are you familiar with the deer collision avoidance thing that was on Highway 3 in the Scott Valley for a while?
Are you talking about the one that was, there was a buried cable on the side of the road?
Yeah, with like some reflectors and supposed to flashlights. They took that out, but I mean, it did.
They took it out because it wasn't working very well.
It wasn't. Was it fog related or something?
Well, there's two things. One, it would mechanically break down. And the other was that people weren't reducing the speed very much. And I think it was because they had learned that it was inconsistent. And this is one of the most important things about those kinds of systems, is that once people learn that they're not actually working well, then they don't pay attention to them anymore.
So do you think the design was flawed, just inherently like underbuilt for that?
Yeah, it was definitely underbuilt. I know that system pretty well, and the people who developed it, and it was definitely underbuilt. It was one of the earlier systems, and so it was experimental. But it really should have been experimental, somewhere more controlled. I don't think they had hardened the technology enough to withstand the weather, and so and when people were driving through there, even if it said this is an experimental system, people don't necessarily read everything, right? And we had this experience in a different highway, also Highway 3 in British Columbia, where the system was very expensive and resulted in some behavioral adjustment by drivers, but there was definitely problems with that system as well. But those kinds of systems are improving. I actually work on those kinds of systems myself, but it's not the same as a fence with a crossing. You know, that's they're quite different kinds of things. I really think they should only be in places where it's very difficult to fence. I don't think they should be used everywhere.
Well, one of the other hotspots for deer collision is right up by Black Butte on I-5, right north of Shasta, and it's private property on both sides of the freeway. So getting like the access to put in a overpass would be difficult, but I'd always wondered if, I mean, and at freeway speeds, I don't know. I mean, thinking of how far ahead the warning lights would have to be to trigger drivers to actually slow down in time.
Yeah, well, there was a pretty good study of that in Virginia. And if you go much more than a mile, people just start to forget. People don't actually respond to, in general, all of those signs you see with deer on them or bear, people do not slow down. That's been very well studied. It's also one of the most common things suggested by transportation agencies is we're going to put up warning signs. People think it's a victory. It means nothing. If anything, it detracts from the issue because it makes people think there's been a solution. Signs generally don't do anything to driver behavior unless, and there's some really good cases that have worked, unless people, they read in the press, they hear about it, they learn that, aha, this one works. And when that sign flashes, it really means there's an elk in the road, there's a deer in the road, there's a bear in the road. I better slow down because I don't want to hit it at 70 miles an hour. So in those situations, those systems work. And then they become viable alternatives to crossings. Another thing about fencing and crossings is that there's a legitimate field of research that says in a lot of these areas, we should think mostly about fencing and worry less about the crossings. So in the area you're talking about, if we don't have to build a crossing there, we can build fencing there, right? That we're not going to genetically isolate the deer on one side, you know, from the Siskiyou side, from the Shasta side, by putting in fencing for 5 miles or 10 miles. You know, that's not going to stop. That's not going to stop ecology and evolution. So, you know, it's worth thinking about those as a standalone solution as well as just fencing to prevent particular hotspots.
And the deer aren't just going to march down till the fence ends and go around it, or?
Well, yes, that does happen for bigger species that move longer distances. And the solution to that, fortunately, there is one. If you picture, here's a highway, and every once in a while, there's like a road goes underneath, right?
Oh.
And where that happens, we call that a tie-in point. You can tie the fencing to that point. Basically, you fence from one road to the other road. If they want to go under following that road, which they generally won't, they don't like roads, then they can, but at least they're not getting on the highway in that fenced area. So they can walk around the end of the fence, but when they do that, they end up going under the highway. No big deal, right? So that's definitely a thing you can do. Where it's not a great idea is if you don't have any crossing and you just fence, then yes, at the ends of those fences, the animals can walk around and go onto the highway.
Thank you. I saw Katie's hand go up for a question.
Can you hear me, Fraser?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you for your presentation. And this is something that's very close to my heart. And I really, really appreciate all the work that's been done around this. My question is related to this thing, to the issue of signs. I think that there's, like you said, there's been a lot of research showing that people don't really pay that much attention to signs. But you mentioned something that kind of surprised me, that you had, part of your presentation was about you can put up signs. And I was a little confused about that because clearly I live off of Old Stage Road, and if I tried to put a sign on Old Stage Road, I'd probably get arrested, right? So so maybe you could just clarify what you mean by putting up signs.
Well, you know, I don't care anymore what law enforcement thinks about my suggestions of those kinds of activities. But for artistic purposes only, I will suggest that if you thought that a sign would look really great on your street and you also didn't care, then that's when someone might want to put up a sign.
Yeah,
you know,
and we didn't hear it from you, right?
Yeah, you didn't hear it from me.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, I paid a lot of taxes in my life. I put a lot of my life into civic service, and at the end, you start to get a little frustrated, you know. So if the powers that be don't take it seriously, and I think it's serious, and there's objective reasons to think it is, then I don't see why I should wait around. Now, not everybody has that kind of personality. So the other way to go is to go to the city, the county, and say, look, we know that there have been collisions here. We know that people are speeding down this road. Here's a picture, here's a video, here's whatever evidence there is. And we want some enforcement in this area. I mean, that's how local transportation projects happen. is that people raise an issue and then it eventually gets solved. And I brought up speed because that is actually the cheapest way to reduce roadkill. If you think about it, there's really nothing cheaper. The cost of speed reduction is enforcement. And there's, that's the amount enforcement would cost is like 20 feet of fencing a year, right? So it's really, if we can enforce reduced speeds, we're going to reduce roadkill proportionally. Even greater than proportionally. If you slow people down from 70 to 35, you'll have you won't have a 50% reduction, you'll have a several-fold reduction in roadkill, because especially at night, the distance you can see, and do it this way, the distance it's hard to line up on Zoom, the distance you can see at the end of your headlight is less than the distance for you to stop at 70 miles an hour or at 55 miles an hour. You have to be going 35 or 40 miles an hour to be able to stop in time for something you see at the edge of your headlight cone. Nobody drives that way, I mean, we don't drive that way. We drive a little faster than, I definitely am guilty of that. I drive faster than the edge of my headlight cone because I don't think about it that way. I'm not thinking about it quantitatively. And so, if we couldn't get that enforced, then that's going to have a huge conservation benefit. Very difficult to do. Almost everything in conservation is. So.
Fraser, I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, again, thank you so much for your wisdom. This is fascinating. Second of all, I don't think anybody's going to throw you in jail for putting a sign up. So I encourage that, of course, with you, Katie, as well. I know what you're talking about. I'm curious because some of those, it certainly seems for making a wildlife crossing, an underpass is much simpler, cheaper than an overpass. And I was wondering, some of those tunnels, obviously each situation is different, but have you seen any situation where those tunnels could be put in without impacting the road, that they can go low enough engineering wise that they can just dig a tunnel through, not even having to stop the traffic if there's enough buildup?
Yeah. There's a whole suite of things that you'll never get to find out. I mean, I only discovered this thing that you're talking about a year ago. The California Coastal Commission brought me in. They were having a little tiff with Caltrans, and they wanted to know what I thought. And Caltrans, they were just not going to give Caltrans a permit for a highway activity on one because it's in their jurisdiction, unless Caltrans considered wildlife impacts. And in that discussion, for the first time I've ever heard, Caltrans engineers were open about what they could do in the sense that you're talking about. And they said, yeah, for a 6 or 8 foot culvert, they can drill right through the roadbed and never stop traffic, because the Coastal Commission had all the cards, said, you better play ball and tell us what you can do, or we're not going to give you the permit, right?
That's great.
So they had to disclose, and they disclosed, yeah, they can drill through. They just don't want to, right? Now, they legitimately said as you go up in size, the ability to do that really exponentially declines, because like a 20-foot culvert is, from an engineering perspective, is so big, apparently it's almost impossible to drill. But a 8 or 10 foot is possible. And a lot of the structures that we study, and certainly on I-5, the two-lane each direction parts of I-5, and many of parts of 97, 89, and all the other ones, you could drill through, put in an 8-foot culvert, and you'll get plenty of wildlife going through. I mean, we've studied them all over the state, and an 8-foot box culvert or a 10-foot box culvert, you'll get plenty of wildlife going through. A lot of the pictures I showed you were from those situations.
Right.
So
right.
that's a great example of, it's technically feasible. It doesn't disrupt traffic. So what are you talking about? You're talking about money. And this is where I kind of feel like, okay, give me a break. A mile of Interstate 405 in Los Angeles cost $175 million in 2018, right? So there's the frame. If you can spend, and while they were building it, there was plenty of conflict among local decision makers saying, it's just going to get congested again. And that's exactly what's happened. So, you know, that was $175 million spent for a mile. It's per mile. It wasn't, they didn't just do 1 mile, it was per mile. And they got maybe 3 years of congestion relief for that $175 million. So if somebody says, well, we just don't have the money, like, yeah, okay, that's just not true. There's $20 billion a year spent in California on transportation.
Wow. Well, thank you. And certainly an 8-foot culvert, you could fit pretty much anything through there.
Yeah, I mean, there are wildlife. You saw the coyote, so that was Interstate 80, and so it's going to have a lot of parallels to 5. In that particular case, the highway, the traffic is quite visible for the animals approaching the culvert, and this is a design issue. It wasn't designed with thinking about that in mind. And so anytime a car goes by or a truck right there above the box culvert, then an animal approaching that box culvert will potentially flee and not use it. But they've used it at other times. So when there's no vehicles there, they'll go through.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we've identified as the Ecology Center here, you know, because as Nick was talking about, the Black Butte Summit is the connection, is the high pass between the Sierra Cascades and the coastal range.
Right.
And, you know, unfortunately, so much of that now has been reduced to fencing, and, you know, it's not at all conducive to that. But we've you know, I know our founder director Michelle has always envisioned an undercrossing there to allow the biocorridor, because it's one of the key spots. I don't know what it would take to do that. And my other question was about is when you have existing roads that go under or over, would additional fencing, you know, to kind of channel the animals into that, does that help somewhat?
Well, if you think of, I think a good example would be Castle Creek Road. So if you get off at south of Dunsmuir, you get off where Castle Creek goes under I-5.
Right.
There's several things there I want to talk about all at once. And so one is that the creek is there, which means that wherever you have a creek going under the highway, you have the potential for wildlife movement in the dry season. In the wet season, it doesn't matter. But in the dry season, they're looking for water, moist vegetation, and so forth. So they'll tend to follow the creeks. So you have a creek, even though it's rip-wrapped, they got there following the creek, right? And then you've got the minor road, which is asphalt, and most animals don't want to walk on it. And then you've got the side of the embankment, which is dirt. If you go look at that, almost any minor road with very little traffic, you'll see trails going across and tracks. So wildlife go through there. You think, aha, well, that could be the solution. Just get them to there. But if you put up camera traps, which I have at that exact spot, you'll see that you get maybe 3 or 4 species go through there. So it's going to work for deer, fox, raccoon, possum, and then maybe skunk. Skunk are actually a little more sensitive than you might think, but it starts to drop off. Like you'll never see a ringtail, variety of other things go through there because it's too disturbed. Now, I've had my best ringtail pictures are actually under I-5, where it crosses the Sac River that goes back and forth a few times.
Right.
Between south of Dunsmuir, about 10 miles. And there's a family of ringtails that grew up right there in front of one of the cameras. It was awesome. But that spot where the camera was a good 50 to 100 feet below the deck of the highway, 50 feet below the deck of the highway. So, you know, if you've got sufficient space, then the more sensitive animals will go underneath. But just a roadway, a minor roadway going under a bridge deck, you know, it's very loud. When trucks go by on that bridge deck, it's very loud underneath there. And so it's a pretty noisy space to expect anything to go through.
So just
And then
because
if any cars go through, it also puts them off as well.
right. So just because there's a passage and an opening, they get spooked way too easily.
Yeah, and actually there's one of the first crossing structures built in California was actually a repurposed minor road, Coal Canyon, under State Route 91 in Southern California. And they took basically a disused minor paved road and turned it into a dirt-based undercrossing. So look, everything looks the same. The trapezoidal underneath of the bridge, you know, and they thought, aha, we built a wildlife crossing out of something that was already there, right? It was a great idea, but the camera traps show that very few wildlife go through there. There's a culvert that's 50 feet away. It's about a 6-foot diameter culvert, actually box culvert. And a lot of wildlife go through there because it's slightly lower and protected from the traffic. So as you're approaching this bridge undercrossing, you can see all the cars going by and hear them. It's very loud, very bright. And this culvert, which is a drainage culvert, pretty crappy thing from a crossing point of view, but it's much quieter there, and that's where the wildlife go.
Fascinating.
Thank you. It looks like we have just enough time for any last question or comment. If anybody has any.
Do you have any updates on the crossing that's got the Wildlife Conservation Fund grant that's on 97 north of Weed?
Yeah, no.
It's still in like the design, right? Like it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to know more about that, but they went into kind of a secretive mode. Like I gave them a lot of camera data and roadkill data. Caltrans was happy to get it, and then I just never heard anything after that. So I was hoping to continue to be involved, but I think they have. I mean, it's kind of a weird culture. The Wes Stroud, who's a really good person for you guys to meet and get to know at District 2, he's in Reading. He's in charge of that and any other wildlife crossing project that takes place in your area. And I would definitely get on his radar and talk to him and advocate. He's very friendly, very accommodating, but they have a culture and they have a way of doing things. They will tend to go to their on-call consultants, and they have, generally speaking, Caltrans has a pretty secretive process for developing these kinds of projects. They think of it as a business approach, forgetting where their funding comes from and what kind of agency they are. And but it's good to remind them, you know, and to ask them those questions.
So you think
would
it's going to
ask
happen? It's just delayed?
I have no idea.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, and actually, I don't think Wildlife Conservation Board funding should be given to Caltrans for these projects. I think they should spend transportation funds.
I do too.
Thank
Well,
you.
I think it's a travesty because Caltrans, a single crossing structure under I-5 is going to be a $10 million project at least, right?
Even just drilling the tunnel.
Well, no. The drilling activity will be one of those 10, but you've got both directions and they're separated from each other. So it's really two drilling activities.
Right.
And then the planning, the environmental assessment, the structural work, and so on. It's my guess, because putting one under one direction of I-5 for the two direction, for where it's split, not Black Butte necessarily, but in other places that I've got in my head, it would be more expensive. Under Black Butte, maybe it would be 5 million, but it's going to be several million because it's fairly long and the drilling activity would take a lot. The RFPs, the annual WCB funding is like 15 to 20 million, right? So if you think about one of these projects, it's a huge suck on that pot of money. And Prop 1 and Prop 68 funding should not be spent in that way. I think those projects should happen, but they should come from SB1, the fuel tax funds, not from Prop 1 and 68 funds.
Wow.
Katie, did you have a question?
No, actually, just a comment that I know we're finishing up, and I wanted to say thank you. And even though I see we only have 7 participants, I want you to know that you've made an impact, because I learned a lot personally, and I went to that website, and I'm going to start, just in a little way, upload pictures and give you whatever data, because I think data is the groundwork for to justify use of funds.
Yeah.
So I want to be a part of that, and I'm going to tell people I know, because I didn't know about this and in others. So I just want you to know that, you know, you've made an impact here tonight. And also, I might, Catherine, maybe talk to you at some point, because there might be some kind of committee, put our heads together. There's probably a lot of work already going on around this kind of thing in our area, but I'm interested in being a part of that.
Yeah, sure. I want to, I'm kind of like you guys. I imagine when you guys are advocating, you don't want the conversation to end. So I'll tell you a couple things. Number one, these are things I just forgot to put in there. A lot of us take for granted wildlife being around, and there's this shifting baseline thing where, you know, people 50 years ago, they would see a bunch of stuff we don't see anymore. We just don't know that that happened, right? And most of my colleagues would probably agree with this statement that especially for an area like California, traffic will cause wildlife extinctions locally and generally. And most of the reason that even a common animal like mule deer are in decline is because of cars. It's not hunting, it's not poisoning, it's not disease, you know, wasting disease, it's vehicles. And probably 80 to 100,000 mule deer are killed per year by cars out of a population of about 800,000 to 1 million. So about 10% of the deer population in California is killed per year by cars. Not fire, you know, leaving out fires, all the other causes of their mortality. So this is not a, you know, local aesthetic or other kind of concern. This is a significant ecological concern. And so I would strongly advocate that that you all get involved. The other thing is that the data collection, it's not it carries so much weight now, as you pointed out, Katie. Our system is the second largest in the world for roadkill data, and you can tell that I like doing things with wildlife. Hopefully, you can tell that. It's a big hammer, right? It's a big hammer to wield. It only happens because people collect data. I didn't collect all those data. I only collected 1,500 or 2,000 of those observations, right? This is not a private database. This is a totally public database. And it's very effective. It's a very effective tool in getting wildlife conservation stuff done. People not related, I don't know who they are. They use these data to advocate for wildlife crossings. They use it to get funding for wildlife crossings. You know, it's absolutely essential. So anything you can do to get people to collect data and put it in that system is going to help wildlife. Whether you're wielding the hammer or somebody else, you know, it's really, really important.
Thank you.
Fraser, I just wanted to thank you. This has been incredibly informative, because I really had absolutely no idea the extent of this problem. I mean, obviously I'm aware of roadkill, but
yeah,
but the numbers are just overwhelming when I think about it. And so I really want to thank you for waking me up. So
Nick just asked if it can be an app. It's essentially an app. We call it a web app. You can use it in Safari on your phone. If you have an iPhone, you can use it, you know, so it's an
that
app.
makes sense.
We've developed 2 different apps over the last 12 years, and we've never had funding for this, for California Roadkill Observation System itself. We've had funding for other things that I cited, but not for that. And you would need dedicated funding to update apps about every 6 months. If you develop a smartphone app, you have to keep funding going to update it. Otherwise, it won't work as you get system updates on different phones. So we just don't bother. So web app.
I like web apps.
Cheap way to go.
Thank
Well,
you.
it's very exciting, and I think we should absolutely publicize this opportunity, certainly for our Ecology Center. And Katie, I think if you're still connected to the Land Trust, you know, whatever we can do locally with our environmental nonprofits to promote this, and just remind people all the time, if you see something, say something, right? I mean, that's the idea. So
Yeah.
I think we need to put that into our newsletters and little reminders, and it's easy to do and it obviously is effective. So thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you all for your good work as well.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to, say thank you again to everybody who showed up here, and thanks to Fraser for sharing his time and his expertise with us. And we'll definitely follow up with the recording of this presentation to you all if you ever want to refer back to it. And I'll also include the links that Fraser had in his presentation in an email. And Katie, definitely, as I was watching the presentation, I was like, the Ecology Center should maybe have some kind of maybe volunteer program for this in our area. I mean, I think this is something that we could definitely take on at some point. So yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, I'll send you a PDF of the PowerPoint as well, so you have the links in there.
Awesome. That sounds great. Well, thanks all, and we will see you next time.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Fraser.
Fraser.
Appreciate it a lot.
Bye.
Do visit anytime.
Oh yeah, I go through there all the time.
That'd be great. Take care.